Welcome to the Inferno Cast. Today's guest is a black belt in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. She's won world championships and Pan American championships and also got to compete in Abu Dhabi. She's been one of the most known female black belts in the first 12 dirty dozen of females to receive their black belt in America. And she continues to carry on the Jiu Jitsu lineage and history with everything she does with traveling seminars to her artwork. Please welcome Miss Felicia O. How are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm good. I'm just, trying to survive during this unique time, but it's really, given me an opportunity to connect with a lot of people like yourself. And I'm really excited to hear some fun stories and kind of get your perspective on martial arts.
Well, I guess that's the silver lining right now. I mean, we've got to meet through this in this
Absolutely.
weird time.
Yeah, absolutely. And my buddy Jack Toffer, who, is familiar with you and a friend, he connected us and he really spoke very highly of you. And he's like, man, you're going to really enjoy this. And so I really wanted to go back to the beginning because you were an athlete most of your life, correct? Before jiu-jitsu?
Okay, so yeah, I was an athlete growing up, doing a lot of different things, but I was never really good at any of the sports. So I really loved doing sports and playing sports. Like I said, I wasn't that good. I was competent, but not great at anything. But I think one of my big sports was gymnastics, which I was not very good at.
Yeah.
But I think that kind of laid certain groundwork for working really hard and just being very intrinsically motivated because, like gymnastics and later I realized wrestling and jiu-jitsu, like there's not a lot of external reward for it. It's like just hours and hours by yourself repeating, and so you kind of learn how to work or how to do it for your love of what you're doing, as opposed to I'm going to get a big contract or I'm going to have some other.
Yeah, instead of the chasing the fame and what could happen and the glitz and glam, it's more of a what you can push yourself to with your personal limits and what you can accomplish. Yeah, that makes total sense. And a lot of gymnasts that transition over, like I know when I get a gymnast in the gym, I'm always excited because the core strength, the flexibility, the work ethic, it usually translates to jiu-jitsu so strongly that it's just, it's very noticeable when you have somebody with a gymnastics background doing jiu-jitsu.
Yeah. I think as a kid, I think it's really helpful, and having taught kids as well, anything that they do at a young age definitely stays with you and changes your mind, changes your body, and lays that groundwork. Because I stopped gymnastics when I was 15.
Mm-hmm.
And I hurt my back and I had to quit. Eventually I did other sports here and there, but then I didn't start jiu-jitsu till I was 33. But it does change your body because of how you've trained it at a young age.
Yeah, I mean, well, you've basically been an athlete most of your life, so when you do find it, it just, even though it's a new skill, a lot of the attributes you already had give you a little bit of momentum to where you kind of have the mind-body connection and the coordination and, there's just some attributes that come with being an athlete. So why so late in life? How did this happen? Was there an individual trigger?
I never knew anything about jiu-jitsu or fighting. I actually had no desire to do anything with martial arts or fighting. And it was just kind of by accident. One year I went on a camping trip and I did the LA Marathon just as a challenge to do, something to do. And the LA Marathon was a horrible experience. Like there was a big thunderstorm and rain and all this stuff. And then a few months later, I ended up going on a camping trip up to Mount Whitney that turned into quite a nightmare with a storm coming in. And it was actually my friend, her husband was telling me about jiu-jitsu on the way up. And I was like, okay, whatever. I don't understand what you're talking about. It's fighting, but you're not hitting or kicking people. So I don't understand what that is. And then as the trip progressed and actually progressively got worse, on our way back, I was like thinking, the outdoors hasn't been so good for me, which I was already had a bit of an aversion to. But then I was like, hey, what was that thing you were telling me about? Like that sounds interesting. Maybe I'll try that next. And so I just went the next week, like 2 days later, I went to his jiu-jitsu academy, which happened to be Jaques Machado. And I just went in and I watched one day, and then the next day I went and tried it and just kept going.
So, you didn't enter into martial arts seeking self-defense. There wasn't some, I'm a kid watching movies and video games or comic books that inspired you to participate. It just came out of pure curiosity. Do you think that came from you being, I mean, I would almost say almost an extreme athlete? I mean, when you run a marathon for fun, like, I mean, that's some legit athleticism. Were you
I
seeking?
would say fun. I would say a challenge.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, so was it just like something new and different, or this could be difficult and challenging? Like, what triggered the curiosity?
Well, I think I wasn't so conscious about it at the time, but what I think is that everything about it scared me.
Mm,
So every aspect of jujitsu were things that I didn't like. I didn't like the close contact. I don't want someone touching my neck. I don't want to get choked. Like even I would wear scarves in the earlier years, and I would still, oh, I'm sure that I've been hanged in another life. Like I always had this fear about my neck. So um, I think just literally everything about it scared me. And so that's kind of how I deal with those things, is I kind of just put the blinders on and jump into it, and not even consciously thinking I'm going to face my fear. It was kind of like I just get drawn to things I don't like.
you basically want to conquer things that could possibly conquer you. Like, I
Yeah.
got to get it before it gets me. I mean, that's very admirable. I like that you talk about the neck thing, because I've been training, people my entire life, and usually I would say like 80% of the female athletes I work with, whether it be self-defense, kickboxing, like, they have a very strong aversion to their neck being touched. Pretty statistically common amongst female athletes. And the scarf idea, I never thought about that. That's a really good idea. That I'm sure there's some girls out there that can probably really identify with that, as
Yeah.
far as just the neck thing is just very uncomfortable for them, that you have to overcome. How long do you think it was before the physical contact stopped being weird?
I don't know, maybe a few months, but again, I just kind of put the blinders on, and it it I didn't think too much about being the only female in the room. It was just kind of like, this is what it is, and there just happened to not. I wasn't like, where are the other women? I just kind of went. But I also used to work in very male dominated uh, places, so industry. So
Yeah.
it wasn't new to me, and I tend to be kind of a verbal crap talker, so it kind of was fine. And when I started, I had a really good group of guys that was in the beginning class with me, and they kind of took me in and were my big brothers,
Yeah.
and kind of protected me. So
It's a good community that was taking care of you. As we all know, that white belts are the most dangerous people on the planet.
yeah.
We all know that that's who you got to watch out for. Um, how long do you think it was before you made like the transition of, I am a jujitsu athlete now that is going to go and achieve with this. I'm going to accomplish something as part of my identity, versus this is just something I'm doing and learning right now?
I don't know if that there was a specific transition, and I think I started competing 6 months after I started training, and so competition was always kind of a part of the learning process for me, and somehow that was already built in. I know, like when I've mentored and taught other people, I kind of had to explain it to them a little bit. But for me, I kind of figured it out. It was like, I go to a competition, and that's where I get the feedback of what I need to work on. So if I get stuck being mounted at a tournament, or I get armbarred, then the next day I go back and that's what I work on. So somehow, like, just subconsciously, I already understood all that. And so I would always enter any tournament, and I'm a pretty competitive person. So I would just keep doing that. And, it's just such an evolutionary time. I don't know that um, that the term jujitsu athlete was something that existed at the time. I think that's a more recent, maybe in the last 5 to 8 years, where people, with the growth of the sport and with all the tournaments and the money, um, you know, you have blue belts going to pro tournaments and winning more money than anyone did at Abu Dhabi, you know, like it's pretty crazy in a great way, right? It's like so much opportunity for people, and it shows the growth of the sport, for men and for women, especially too.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know that I ever defined myself as that. And I just kept going. You know, there's another tournament. Oh, I'll sign up for that. And you know, when I was coming up there, my teacher, my master, Jaques Machado, he was competing in Abu Dhabi, and literally like 3 or 4 months after I signed up, he went to go compete at Abu Dhabi. But I didn't even know what it was at the time. You know, and they didn't have women in that. And eventually, when they added women, and you know, like just everything lined up, that the opportunities were there at the right time. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, I mean, I would say that you did, because like jujitsu just kind of absorbed into your life gently, where you didn't have the moment where it's like I was in this one tournament and this thing happened and then that's when I knew, like because with the way you've described it, you're such a focused, achieving person that whatever you participate in, I would take a wild guess, absorbs a lot of your energy, time, and focus. So
Yeah, I tend to get very immersed in things, and jujitsu, it was, you know, people are like, well, I'm going to start training, you know, at my peak, you know, I train 2 or 3 times a day, 5 to 7 days, 6 days a week, which a lot of people didn't do back then. Now you have professional jujitsu athletes, but that wasn't anything you had back then. And so every once in a while I'd do well at a tournament. I'd come back to the academy, be like, oh, I'm so inspired. I'm going to go from 2 days a week to 5 days. And after the 3rd day, they would be dead. Right.
yeah.
But it just slowly takes over your life. And I'll actually tell that to people when, you know, at some point when I get a friend to start training, I'm like, don't hold it against me. Don't hold me responsible that this sport's going to take over your life in a good and bad way. Right. So when I was starting, I only went 2 times a week, and I just said, okay, I'm going 2 days a week, and that's my schedule. So it was never I don't feel good, I'm not going to go, because I know a lot of people suffer from that. And I tell people, look, you need to keep your stuff in your car and you go straight from work to the academy. And if you have an hour or two, everyone has their phone. You can do your work on your phone, get caught up on emails, Instagram, whatever you want to do. But if you go home and you sit down, if you eat something and you sit down, you're not going to get back up. So you kind of have to just take that out of the equation. I know for me, I had become a really big Laker fan. And I was really into watching the Lakers, which took me a long time, because growing up, I was a Sonics fan up in Seattle. So it took me a long time to get over that. And so I became this really big Laker fan. And I remember I also had a TiVo at the time, you know, like it was like late 99, 2000. And so I would record the games. And as I got more and more into jiu-jitsu, the games started piling up on my TiVo. And I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot thinking, I have to make a decision. I'm going to have to give up watching the Lakers if I'm going to keep training jiu-jitsu like this. You know, because it went from 2 days a week, and then I did a tournament, and then, you know, you get a lot of feedback and excitement from that. And then it's like, okay, I'm going to train a little bit more. And then, you know, you end up doing another tournament. I'm going to train, you know, I'm going to add another day. I'm going to add another day. So then, you know, eventually you're training 4 days a week. And then I think that was when that decision came. It's like, I'm going to start training more days a week. I don't have more time to watch and catch up with the games. I mean, I went down to like watching the last 2 minutes, like the last quarter, and then the last 2 minutes. And then it was like, you know, watching the last 2 minutes of the game isn't the same as watching the whole drama of the game unfold.
Yeah,
and I
you're
can't
right.
commit to 2 hours anymore.
Yeah.
So I had to give that up.
So do you remember when somebody asked you what you did and your answer was, I do jujitsu? Was there a time in your life where like the answer changed? Because I'm sure up to a certain point in your life, it's like, oh, well, I was a gymnast, or I'm a runner, I do these things. Like, was there a transition where you're like, yeah, I'm a jiu-jitsu person?
You mean like as a job or as an identity?
As an identity, I would say, is like when people would, poke and prod about what defined you, who you were, introducing yourself to people, or as you
I
gain more?
usually leave that to the latter part of the conversation, um, because for years it was all no one knew what it was. Now more people understand it now because of the UFC. But even a few years back, it becomes kind of a bigger conversation. You can't just say, "Oh, I'm an accountant. I'm a lawyer." So when I had other jobs, I would say that. But even now, like I've always had kind of a few different part-time jobs. So like there's easier. It just depends how much investment you want to make in this person that you're having a conversation with, right? If it's somebody you don't want to talk to, you just kind of let it go. But it was always the conversation. Oh, well, I do Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Well, I do martial arts.
Right.
Oh, like karate. Like it was always there's this whole conversation that you knew was going to happen, and so I kind of had the routine of what to say. So then it was like, well, I don't know. Do you watch the UFC? Which you can get away with a lot more now. Then you kind of say, well, if you watch UFC, it's kind of like the ground stuff. Like when they get choked and they tap, it's that stuff because I don't like the hitting and kicking part. But before, it would kind of be, it was, if you said martial arts, then it would always be karate or kung fu. And, everyone knows like, oh, my friend's daughter has a black belt and she's 10. And
Yeah.
like, awesome, like, oh, that's wonderful. But, like sometimes I would say, well, it's kind of like wrestling.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And it just depends. Then you're like, no, not like the Undertaker. No, like, the other kind of wrestling in the Olympics.
Everything
But
you're saying is just so stereotypical for like pre-2010. Like,
yeah,
anything in the 90s and early 2000s was just like pulling teeth to explain what jiu-jitsu was or what a submission was. They're just like Bruce Lee, karate, wrestling, like you said, like professional WWE wrestling. Like that was usually it.
yeah.
Yeah. So I was just kind of curious if you ever had any apprehension of defining yourself through being like, 'cause when I define jiu-jitsu athlete, it's a more of a self perspective of that defines who you are to a degree, not in totality, but it's, it becomes a part of your identity of like, no, this is a primary part of who I am. So whenever I ask, like, when you transition to the jiu-jitsu athlete, when people ask questions, was there a time in your life to where there was any apprehension of like, no, like jiu-jitsu is my life. This is what I do. If there was that type of transition, or if it just kept sneaking in until one day you're like, I'm going to the Abu Dhabi and this is awesome.
It just is. Yeah. Like it's just being in that moment and being what you are. I don't. Yeah, I mean, I don't even think now I would use the term jujitsu athlete. I think I'm kind of old and, can't quite be at my peak anymore. Like that day's past. Um,
Well, there's different degrees of athletes. Like you're always in the game. So
yeah, and I'm totally into that, and I like to still compete, and in that sense too. Back in the day, you would never do the masters. Like it was a joke. And so when I came into jiu-jitsu, there weren't a lot of masters divisions anyway. And then for women, there weren't even regular divisions for women, at a lot of levels.
it was a different time to where there wasn't as many stepping stones,
Yeah.
for beginners and even more advanced. I mean, because like right now, masters divisions are almost more entertaining sometimes because all of these legends are now just they're filled up, and you have so many people to watch that are still competitive and just.
Well, yeah, that's where I got lost. Yeah, back to Masters. Yeah, like now when you go to Masters Worlds, it's like this amazing tournament because all those guys coming up, like, and I mean a lot of the guys way before me that laid that ground before me, like you're competitive people, and especially when you were doing it at a time when there wasn't money and there wasn't all the seminars and there wasn't all these other avenues that you can live by. You were always struggling regardless. So those guys, to go to that tournament and to see people that you saw coming up and they're back out on the mat, it's awesome.
It's definitely my favorite event of the entire year. I mean, like, love
Yeah.
Worlds and Fans, but I just Masters Seniors. The Masters Worlds event in Vegas, like you said, because you still have the regular, like the Vegas Open is happening, and then They do the super fight. I mean, it just, yeah, they've hit it on the head with that event, and I love it just because you just got
But,
history. You know?
and so much of it is the way the venue is set up.
Yeah.
Because you're right there, you're close to everybody. It's really big. And just by nature of the flow, you end up walking by and seeing a lot of people. Where at a lot of the other tournaments, it's like the big
Oh, yeah.
bleachers.
At the
And,
pyramid, you're like piled on 30 people trying to cheer and coach. And
but also, like, I'll go to a tournament, like at the pyramid or whatever, and I'll not see a lot of people that I know. And then later on Instagram or Facebook or something, I'll see that they were there. And I was like, oh man, I didn't even see you because they were sitting on another place hitting away. But just the nature of how that place is set up is like, you keep crossing paths and you're just like, oh my gosh, you know, you see all your friends and you see like people that you don't know and you go, oh, like I want to get a picture with that guy. And, you know, it's just a very cool venue and a very cool event. So
I really feel like the reason it is so popular because of that design is because jiu-jitsu is so community oriented, you know, and it really kind of allows more of that community just with this layout, like you said, you know, because we're very social people as far as like you want to see everybody and get pictures and, you know, tell stories and just it's just so community oriented. And when you started jiu-jitsu, did you feel that whenever you started training and when you're on the team of just like a very tight tribal community?
in terms of at the academy or at
Yeah,
competitions,
whenever you started, when you started the academy and you started classes, like, did you immediately feel like drawn into this community, or did it take time?
you know, I did. And there, I always tell people like, they're kind of this different sub communities within jiu-jitsu, right? So when you go to your academy, like I said, like those guys in my beginning class, those guys really helped me and made me feel safe to be there, right? And if someone came in and was a kind of a jerk, they would kind of handle it, right? They're like,
Yeah.
keep an eye out for me, like, hey, you know. So that was really nice. And then when I started competing, then you start having this whole other community of people and friends that are competitors from other academies. Otherwise, you know, there was always this, you know, it still goes on where you don't go to other academies, you don't mix, you don't train with other people, but now you have all these people that you meet at tournaments that you become friends with. And so there's that whole other subset because we only had a couple of people that competed for my academy. And then my friends and I would go and they would help support me and I'd help support them. But there was only a few of us. And then you would have this whole other group of people. And, you know, I think the thing that's really nice in jiu-jitsu, I was going to say like everyone's very accessible. Right. So when you see people, it's accessible. And I think part of that is the humility of jiu-jitsu because you're always rolling with people and you are in close contact with people. So there's this different intimacy. And it's like, even in old days, like if you were out somewhere at a mall or whatever, and hardly anyone did jiu-jitsu, but you saw someone that it was like a secret club. They had like another team's shirt on and you were like, oh, I know that's a jiu-jitsu guy. Yeah. Oh, I know the place that's from. And you'd see him and you'd kind of go,
Yeah.
you know, it was like this secret underground club. And now you know, and then eventually the UFC and tap out, and then everyone was wearing tap out. And then you're like, that dude doesn't even train. He just wears tap out. But that was, you know, at the infancy of MMA growing.
Yeah,
But
I can
back then,
remember when, like, if you wore a fighter T-shirt, like, you better be a fighter. You know, it was just like, if you're wearing the shirt, you better be legit. But yeah,
yeah.
I like what you're talking about. Now you got to kind of use the ears, where it's like,
yes,
two ears, you're like, hey man, what, you know, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, I'm sure it's gonna be close. So yeah, definitely.
and then it was even weirder though too, being a female, right? So I see them, I'm like, oh, and then I just like, oh, do you train? You know, and I never understood in jiu-jitsu is a weird thing. Like, I don't know, do bicyclists see each other and they go, hey, do you train? But we know, like when you say, do you train? That doesn't mean, do you ride a bike? That means, do you train jiu-jitsu? Not, do you train weightlifting? Do you train basketball? It was just like our own little
our own little vernacular. Yeah,
it's like, oh, you train? I was like, oh yeah, you know, like you already immediately knew it was jiu-jitsu or fighting, right?
Yeah, it's like we have the secret handshake of, do you train? And cool, like, you know,
Yeah.
I mean, there's little indicators you look for it to connect with people. Yeah, that definitely is. Many people in airports have met new friends because of t-shirts and cauliflower ears of just starting to talk to strangers that now you have something to connect with. And
Yeah.
so do you feel like when you started gaining momentum, blue belt, purple belt, into brown belt, um, were you so competitively focused that it was what's the next tournament, or was it a pursuit of I'm just going to be the best that I can be for the rest of my life? Like, was it kind of
I
short term or long term?
it was just like, I want to get better. I want to get better. I want to get better faster. How can I absorb this quicker into my mind and into my body? And I don't know. I got my black belt pretty quick, but I don't know. I mean, I still say, oh, I can't remember shit, like it's kind of an ironic thing, but I think through the repetition and the mat time, it's just really spending a lot of time on the mat that your body starts to absorb it. It does become
Oh, yeah.
imprinted into
I
your
think
muscle.
it's the 1,000-hour rule, like that. There's a book called The Talent Code that talks about, like when you drill and you train the body, that actually builds myelin on the neurons, that makes you react faster. I mean, like they're scientifically measuring these things now with overachievers and performers. And jiu-jitsu is no different. And that was going to be my next question is, so what is some advice you have for people to increase their learning curve, to kind of make it a little bit sharper? And would it be just doing classes 2 or 3 times a day, trying to commit more hours per week, learning off the mats, watching videos, studying film? What advice would you give to somebody trying to speed up the process?
I think it's so different now that there's so much more information, and maybe it's almost like there's too much information now. Like
Overwhelmed.
I think there's also this, the issue of people trying to learn the newest, coolest thing without learning a hip escape or a lot of foundational stuff, right? There's a lot of that missing because of the lure of competition, right? I still think you have to be somewhat complete and understand all the positions at some level. I think it's still mat time, like as much as you can learn technique. And, we were just talking about like how people are really techniqued out because right now we're in quarantine 2020. And unless you're married to someone, or if you're, I know some people are secretly going on training, but on a regular basis, it's really hard to get the practice in right now. But I think it's really mat time because you can learn as many, you can say, I know 7,000 techniques, but can you do it live against somebody that is actively trying to stop you from doing it and knowing what you're doing? That is completely different. And having your brain and your body function as a unit in response to being present to what's going on in that moment is a whole nother skill.
So you talk about being in that moment.
Yeah.
What other sports or activities have you done in which it requires you to be very attentive in that moment, that brings your focus to where like you can't be worried about what just happened, you can't worry about what's happening to you, like you got to be in that moment or else something can go sideways?
Well, I think jiu-jitsu does that the most, that has the highest consequence and has the high need of focus. But I think what happens though for me is that I get lost in it and it becomes the flow state kind of thing. And I think that I go into that space in a couple other areas of my life, but it's not so much concerned with consequence. And I think when you get into flow state, I don't think in jiu-jitsu you worry about consequence quite as much, but it kind of pops in every once in a while when someone's around your neck, right? But I think like when I'm making art, when I'm designing things or building things, I get into that very present moment of getting lost in where you are. And I love being in that place. I used to do it when I was doing computer graphics, which I don't do anymore, but mostly making work. And then when I do jujitsu, but when I'm making art, like you don't necessarily have the consequence that you do with jujitsu.
I would almost say that the consequence is actually more of just the idea of distraction, because like for you, you've taken this artistic expression of jujitsu, because it's martial arts, like there's this artistic form because it has to be for you and how you move and your interpretation and your worldview and perspective on things. And now you've taken that into, like these artistic expressions that you do with the different, paintings and I saw some pictures of things that you had made of. So how do you correlate this artistic expression versus it being the physical of, you know, the training, of how it translates into like your artistic expression on a canvas or something like that?
I think it's, I think it is like the heroine of jujitsu. It's the same thing. When you start jujitsu, it's really, really hard. I think the hardest time, probably blue belt is probably, I think, the hardest time, because I think that when you're a white belt, it's hard, but you don't really know what you're getting into, and you don't know what you don't know. When you're a blue belt, you start thinking, and then you have these great moments, and then the rug gets pulled out from under you all the time. And I remember there were times where I just felt I was getting worse and worse and worse every day, every week, every month. I was getting progressively worse, even though I was training regularly, right? And I think, like I've tried to learn music in many, many forms and fashions, and being Asian and growing up with Asian parents, I started piano when I was 3 and violin when I was 4. And there's always the talent and hard work, and that combination of where those things come together. And as much as I tried to learn, and in future times, other instruments and music, I could never transcend. I could never get past being very aware of the rote of what was going on. I think in the movie, I always remember the movie Amadeus, where there was Salieri and Amadeus just felt it and did, where Salieri was the guy that was trying to do.
Yeah.
I think for me in music and certain things, in gymnastics and certain sports, I wanted to be able to do that, but I could never get past the learning and being consciously doing things to transcending that to being unconscious, the subconscious comes out and you get into that flow state. In art and in jiu-jitsu, after time, right, you have to learn the techniques, you have to learn the rules, you have to learn all those things, that saying, you have to learn the rules before you can break them. And so you physically and intellectually, you have to understand all those things at some level and learn them, and they get absorbed into your body, into your muscles, literally with jiu-jitsu. And then over time, they become integrated into you that you don't think about it anymore.
Is it kind of moving from the cognitive level to like that, like you said, that subconscious,
Yeah.
body awareness, to where you're not having to do finite processing?
And I think, though, that it is different for everybody. I don't know that everyone can do that with jiu-jitsu. Like, I couldn't do it with music.
Right.
I can't do that learning languages. It's very difficult for me. Like, I think there's a definitely skill, like people know, like my mom speaks 5 languages. I'm like, I can't even get one. So, everyone has different talents. And like I said, like I wasn't very good at any of the other sports, and I never really got to that level in another sport where I could let go and just express, as opposed to being aware of what and how. Jiu-jitsu somehow connected to my brain and to my body in a way that made sense for me. And I had a teacher that explained and taught in a way that made sense to my mind and to my learning and understanding. So like I said, like, I don't know that everybody will be able to do that. I know people that are black belts that aren't able to do that, but yet they still find other things in the sport, like finding that isn't necessarily what everyone is looking for from the sport, right? For me, that's this and art are kind of the 2 places where I can get there. And, sometimes you can say like, well, if I played music recreationally, it would be because I wanted to have that experience, but I could never have the freedom of unleashing it,
Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of people that may not get there in jiu-jitsu, but they have something else that they're getting out of it. It's still that challenge, because it's infinitely challenging.
Yeah, and it's hard to explain until somebody has found that flow state in something, like, because there's people out there that have never found that in anything yet. So
Yes.
they don't even understand, the language you're speaking. But when people have found that in something, then they can identify what that looks and feels like in different avenues and different types of, activities. Do you have any rituals that you use to find the flow state? Like if you're going to do jiu-jitsu, or even if you're going to be artistic, with painting or something like that, do you have anything that you utilize to kind of find that rhythm?
Not really consciously. Well, I think I went through a phase where I was working with a sports psychologist that really helped me and helped me understand that. And so with competition, it would be more like trying to get to that flow state in competition. And there were some things there that I don't really, again, I think those are kind of certain skills that you learn and then they just become part of what you do. So, like getting ready for a competition, I do certain things, not like it just certain things that, I keep track of my meals and stuff like that or whatever, if I'm watching my weight but it's become much looser and much, again, it's like I learned it and then not being at the, height of my competition life anymore at 52. It's not so crucial. Now there's a lot more fun to it. I mean, obviously I still want to win and do well and perform well, but it's not so crucial that I pay attention. And I try to also just be a little more gentle with myself as I'm getting older and have different things going on.
Well, working on the longevity play, because
Yeah.
that's one of the unique things about jiu-jitsu is like you can
Rover.
play. Oh, nice. I like that. I like that. Because you kind of you almost can, like there's not a lot of other martial arts styles where you can go out and kind of play fairly hardcore without taking, just serious damage, especially like striking and boxing and kickboxing. And with jiu-jitsu, you can kind of adjust the speed to where you can keep it very close to, as realistic as possible, but still accommodate for, the injuries and the miles that you put on as you get older. And I think that that's what's so unique about it, that helps people kind of stay attached to it so they don't leave it as much, because because there's a lot of people out there that are in the striking industry, and whenever they're kind of retired, they're kind of done just because of the injuries, the damage. You can't really play anymore.
Yeah. But
So
even wrestling, right? Competitive wrestling,
yeah.
like it's such an intense sport. Um, and I think a lot of those guys are, ending up doing jujitsu because there's so much crossover and so much similarity, but your body can't continue. And it's like, that's not really fun
Yeah.
at a certain level.
At a
If you're
certain
not
level, yeah,
competing,
at a certain level,
if you're
you
not
just stop.
competing regularly at a high real level. But yeah, like it's so different now. Again, what we're talking about with the masters, because so many people are coming to the sport later in life. So you have all these new people coming in from the beginning, at white belt, and they're 40, 50, 60 years old. And then you also have the people that are aging in the sport. And in there, it's made it easier to find training partners to give you that longevity. Where in the old days, it was kill or be killed in a lot of ways. And so then you may not have that longevity. But, now there's the whole jujitsu for everybody, and it has something to offer for everybody. And, for people, sometimes it's just finding the right place to train and the right partners. But then you can roll and keep learning, and it's just, infinite. It's way more fun than exercising in any other way.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just because the physical demands come with the fun part,
Yes.
maybe the best of both worlds. If you look back on the industry the last 20 years, what do you see as some of the most profound changes that you value and you appreciate? You're like, I'm glad this is happening.
Well, definitely the growth of the sport, and at so many levels. There's just so many more people doing it, so many more women doing it. There are all these different cottage industries that have popped out of this, and that there are events where people are making money and charging people for seminars, like in a way that wasn't really imaginable before. And a lot of people that went through the sport had to quit. Some of them still have academies. I mean, it's a trying time right now, with academies, but um, there's a different longevity to it now, which is very cool. And you know, like there's more and more academies everywhere, but it always comes down to finding the right academy for the right person. You know, like not every academy, you know, you can say, oh, this is a great champion, I want to go train with him, but maybe it's a very intense competitive school for 20-year-olds and you're not that demographic. And then, you know, maybe you just need to find, maybe this teacher isn't world famous, but it's more family oriented, or it's more middle-aged, you know, people that have to go back to their regular job on Monday and they can't come in all broken and beat up, you know?
Yeah,
So it's just like there's so much.
black eye.
What's that?
You show up back at the lawyer's office with a black eye, people ask questions.
Yeah, especially if you're a female.
Yeah. Well, what's your take on the female growth within the sport? Like it's like for me, I've trained athletes since I was a teenager, and I actually prefer working with female athletes because I just feel like once you kind of get through the initial threshold of whether it be striking, MMA, or jiu-jitsu, like it's almost easier to outline the plan. It's like, hey, this is what we need to do, and then it's done. And with a lot of the guys, I feel like that drags on for years. And I know for myself where it's like pride and ego get in the way, where it's like, well, I can't try it all 100% because then I might fall on my face and fail. And so when I look at the female athlete perspective, I mean, I am such a fan of everything that's happening, the growth and the technical prowess and the athletic prowess. So what's your opinion on it, of what's happening in the industry?
I think it's, you know, I think it's awesome, right? Like, I think there's a difference in learning with men and women in a physical environment like jujitsu. And what my experience has been is guys will come in, learn a technique. We'll say learn a technique. I'm kidding. But they will just do what they think they're being told. And they won't pay attention to detail. And they're just like, they're a little cavemanish, but it's kind of biological, right? Like there's no right or wrong, or it just is. And it doesn't mean I'm pigeonholing or stereotyping. It's like, just generally speaking, the men that I've taught, they will just do whatever they think is the thing, and they will use their strength and they will do whatever to compensate and not pay attention to little details. Women just don't have the strength all the time. And so the guys miss out on some of the technical stuff. But I also see that females at a certain point, and I'll say is like, I think it's biological in the same way that the guys are a little bit cavemanish. It's like, it's biological. Like they're out, you know, hunting and we're gathering, right, at a certain level. And so I think there's a thing with women at a certain level, like they want to know at a certain age as well, that they want to know everything before they even try it. They have all these questions before they try, where the guys are trying it, thinking they're doing it right and just muscling their way through it and not asking questions about the detail. So we have the two extremes, right? And so I'll teach women and they'll keep asking. I'm like, no, you have to do it like 30 times before you get to ask a question. You have to have this experience to base your question on. And then the guy, it's like, okay, now that you've done it, think about what you're doing. Fix this little detail, pay attention to these things. So they come, you know, they're kind of lacking in these opposite sides, right? So I think when you're teaching, you kind of have to compensate for those two things, you know, where it's like, okay, dude, come here, pay attention to this and this. No, you go do it a bunch of times and then come back to me and we'll talk about it, right? So it's managing.
It's
And those are just gross generalities, you know?
for sure. I mean, and sometimes I usually look at it like feminine and masculine energies, because, you know, sometimes, you know, like it's just different, where it's like the feminine energy is usually trying to find a way around the obstacle, you know, think through the problem, where like the masculine energy is usually trying to overrun the problem, where it's like, squish it. And you look at teaching methodologies of the experience of a teacher. If I've taught predominantly masculine energy most of my life, I'm obviously probably not going to teach feminine energy very well. So it almost is like the industry is catching up to different teaching methods that complement different types of athletes. And now I think we're seeing is when you change teaching methodology, or when you make an adjustment for somebody's learning ability and learning theory, you're getting these very high level athletes that are performing and just and unlocking more of jujitsu because we're getting better at teaching it because it's getting more prominent. You know, it's almost just like the growth cycle of life we're just having to go through. And I feel like that the female jiu-jitsu competitor athletic side of it, I mean, even bleeding over to MMA is just really taking over because there's now a method to that level of success.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I really find it entertaining because like all of my female fighters are just so tough. Like it's just, they'll walk through walls, and the guys, you know, they'll be like, oh, my shoulder hurts, you know, and I got some tough guys too, but I pick on them all the time. I'm like, you need to stop complaining all the time. Just do what you're supposed to do. But it really has grown, and I think that you made a lot of good points about just the tendencies of how people learn. And as we become better instructors, you have more people able to rise up. Because I even think back of like when I first opened a little club, I mean, it was a tool shed fight club thing that I was able to train 8 or 9 people because that's the only amount of people that could survive the archaic, naive, silly methodology that was just not even logical. And then now, you know, having so many more students and so many more success stories, it comes from learning more about how to be a better teacher. Like you said, you got to find the right academy and the right coach. And I think with Jean-Jacques Machado, like you were so fortunate, you know, that you found a phenomenal coach.
But, you know, and as a teacher, having the experience of being a teacher, um, I feel like they're different styles in different places and different people, right? Like, I mean, if you want to equate it to Phil Jackson, it's like he has a style and then you have to fit into his system. So there's certain coaches that you go there because they're there and you want to learn that thing. I think there are other coaches, and I think it's almost like being multilingual. It's like, how do I communicate to this person and motivate this person in the way that's best suited for them, that I can get the most and best results out of them. So when I used to teach fitness classes, you know, like depending on who I was talking to, I would speak to them in a different way. So with certain guys, I would almost humiliate them and I would never say it out loud. And I mean, I guess now, you know, like 10, 15 years later, maybe, I don't know if I would have a lawsuit, but there were some guys where I'd be like whispering in their ear, like, don't let that girl beat you. Like, because I knew it would appeal to his ego and it would push him, you know, and then, and just knowing your students and saying what you needed to say to motivate them, you know, and then there were some other guys that, you know, you had to be a little more gentle. It's like, okay, be careful, do this. Yeah. You know, and then you'd have women. And again, this is just generally speaking, some of them would be like, just being more supportive and saying, no, you can do it. You've got this, you got this, you can do this. You can do this. You're doing great. And so it's just finding the right way to communicate with the right people. Likewise, when you're teaching a technique, you know, a lot of times it's finding the right analogy to explain it to them. And so when they don't understand what you're telling them to do, finding another way, you know, after 2 or 3 times and they're not getting it, what you're saying isn't the right thing. They're not getting it. It's not that they don't want to, it's just, it's not making sense to how their brain processes the information. So then I would feel like as a teacher, then how do I communicate this in a different way? What other angle, what other approach? Is it a different analogy? Is it breaking it down in a different way physically by steps? How do I make this usable for them? And, you know, sometimes maybe it's not the right time. Maybe they're not ready for that move yet. And then you abandon that. And that comes back later. Other times it's like, oh, I need to break the move down in a different way. Or I need to make an analogy, some, you know, like if you go, well, they have a background as an accountant or as a lawyer or as a basketball player. If you can translate for them in a way that they understand, you know, you go, oh, it's like when this is this. And then they go, oh, now I understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head when you said multilingual, where it's just like that's what you're doing. And then that almost transcends like gender roles and any stereotypes. It's just you have to speak the language in which people can absorb information the fastest, which you identified perfectly as you parallel the information you're trying to transfer with something they already comprehend on a
Yes.
very high level, which goes back to that personal relationship with your student, because you
Yeah.
got to know what they understand and how they think So you basically become a practical psychologist as a coach because you got to understand, how do you think? How do you work? How do you, how does resistance affect you? How do you overcome obstacles so that you can, paint the narrative as,
Yeah.
with a silly pun of your artistic abilities is paint the narrative that they can comprehend the fastest.
Yeah.
Because especially in the American culture, that's what we're all about, speed. It's like, I need to get better faster. I need this, shorten the process, make it more efficient. But with jujitsu, I feel like the rush is not to get good to beat people. The rush is to get on the journey, and the deeper you get into it, the more that you have like this transitive effect of what you learn on the mats that goes into the rest of your life. Which I would ask, what is one of the biggest lessons do you think jujitsu has had on your life that has affected all aspects of who you are as a person?
I think it's a little bit further back from that. Um, I was about to quit jujitsu. I got sick and had a chronic fatigue issue and I still deal with it. But after 5 years, I was teaching, but I wasn't rolling and training. And I was about to quit the sport. And I got on a different supplement, algae supplement, and I felt better. And I went back to training at Jaques. And I really like teaching, but I really love rolling. And I realized that. And when I went back, I had to also change my life and get rid of a lot of the stresses in my life, whether it was people, jobs, situations, all these things. And I think a lot of us go through this at different times in our life. But what I had to do was really change those things. And, I had my bouts with depression and, my craziness and all this stuff. And when I went back to jujitsu, I started to learn to be more grateful for what I had. And every time I'm on the mat, because I almost quit completely to never roll again. And then when I went back, I realized how much I loved it. And so every time I go on the mat, it's just another bonus that I take that. And I never have a bad day, in on the mat or in my life, like I can have a crappy day and this happens, I get a flat tire and then I go, wow, like, my, you start getting down on yourself. And then I go, you know what? My friend has this problem, or these people have this problem, which is way worse. And I'm really glad that I don't have to deal with that. So really my issues today are nothing compared to what that person is going through. And then I go, okay, I'm good. It's not about me and how shitty my life is or how shitty my day is going. It's like, wow, like, oh, this is really sucks today. But at least it's not, and I'm not saying like, oh, I'm lucky, like, they're worse, but it's just like really like putting it into perspective. It's not like stepping on someone else. It's more just putting my mind in perspective, like adjusting my brain to where I am. And it's like, you know what? It may be shitty that we're not training jujitsu right now and everyone is in there, but you know what? I've also gone through the experience where I've been off the mat for 6 months because of an injury, or 3 months because of an injury, or 5 years because of chronic fatigue. But aside from that, it's like, guess what? At least I'm not, I don't have the virus. I'm not being sick from it. One friend of mine, she just had a nightmare going through it. Another friend of a friend died. We all know someone. So it's like, I'm really glad that I don't have to deal with that. As crappy as what I'm going through it right now, I'm glad that it's not that. So I have nothing to complain about. Just deal with what you have and be grateful for what you have. Because there's always people that are in worse situations. What if what if you were living in a third world country in poverty and, like, no, I can't train,
Yeah, exactly.
you know?
And that's such a healthy way to look at it. When you were struggling with like these emotional difficulties and those challenges, do you think that it was more of a lack of a coping mechanism to do it in a healthy way, or do you think that it was just a condition that you needed to find an answer for?
I think it's probably a combination. I think when I was younger, I was a little more crazy, you know. But although the other day, a friend of mine came to help me move some stuff, and I hadn't really been out in the world or spoken to anyone, and I was like a freaking wind-up toy. And I felt
Yeah.
like I was back in my college days where, you know, I went to the psychologist and they were like, you need to stop drinking coffee. And I'm like, I don't drink coffee. What are you talking about? And I was like a little wind-up toy. I was like, oh, blah, 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 blah. And then, you know, she helped me move some stuff, and then I was like, I'm really sorry that I just was like a little manic and crazy, but I think it's because I haven't been able to roll. Not that I am going, oh, I can't roll, which I think in the past I might have had a little more of that tension. I think I'm a little better at dealing with it, but I didn't realize it till it came unleashed. And then I was like, whoa, like, you know, like there's a consequence when I don't get that energy outlet. But I also think that I have better coping mechanisms through life and experience and time. So I think it's a combination, right?
So if somebody was struggling, you know, with self-image problems, depression struggles, you know, trying to always be the achiever, seeking the external for validation.
I've never
Um,
had any of those issues.
yeah. It's like, no, I wouldn't understand that at all. None of us have. None of us have. If you were going to talk to somebody that, you know, was kind of dealing with that, what would be your advice beyond the gratitude, you know, because, you know, them understanding to be thankful and be in the moment. If you were going to give them something beyond just the gratitude, what would you give them to help give them some direction out?
Well, you know, when we were talking about the gratitude, I just flashed on. I think all of these things are a process and a journey, and it just sounds so cliche, but you know, I went through a phase where I wrote down a gratitude journal. And it's just like jujitsu, you know, when you learn a new technique, you have to sit there and drill it. And I had to write down what I was grateful for each day. Every night I'd write down 3 or 5 things or whatever in my little gratitude journal. And after a while, that starts to seep into just who you are, and that you don't have to write those things down anymore. Every once in a while, you have to remember them. It's just the same. You have to sit there and learn how to do an arm bar over and over and over. And then eventually they just become embedded and you don't think about it anymore, and it becomes part of who you are. I think all these things, you know, over time, they start becoming that. I think it's that process. You become aware of it, and then you start to work on it, and that causes this change in you slowly, because I think I've taken steps over the years in these different aspects, and I think slowly over time, they just do start becoming part of who you are, and you forget that a little bit. And then when you asked me that, I was thinking, oh yeah, you know, like I did keep a gratitude journal at one point. And then I went through a phase where I felt like I'm not being grateful enough for things. And so I set up other situations in my life to make me more grateful for those things, to appreciate things, you know, to make them a part of my life.
Yeah.
And then that starts becoming a part of who you are. Like, and you know, I think it just kind of starts rewiring your brain, I think, a little bit. And then you get to test those. Like the real time where you get to test those is when you go around family.
Oh, that is the truth.
Because
Yeah.
I found for me, when you're around family, it brings you back
Yes.
to like this infantile, obnoxious little thing very quickly, because you go back to those patterns and this evolved black belt, all this other stuff that you've
Right out the window.
evolved, gone. And so then it becomes, how do you take those things that you've learned now, and how do you pull them back in to those most primal and most foundational relationships, like whether it's your mom or your siblings, you know, or different things like that. Like for me, I think those are those triggers that in the past I wouldn't be aware of. But some of those behaviors are the things that you've changed. And so now you've changed that here. Now you get back into situations, and sometimes I'll get sucked in, and then you have to go, okay, how do I pull myself? How do I bring the new evolved things that I've learned or become part of me? They get stripped away, and then how do I bring those in to those primal relationships?
It's
And it's
almost
hard.
it's almost that you're rewiring your reactions And when you parallel it with jiu-jitsu, I think you hinted at a very good parallel, because it's like if I show somebody a technique in half guard where they need an underhook, that person knows in half guard, when they make this grip, get the underhook. But when the position changes, do they know the information well enough that they know to get the underhook, even though they're in a completely different position? And it's kind of like when the family's around. Like when the
Yeah.
family's around, the fight happens. You're not in half guard. It doesn't feel like it did in class.
Yeah.
Do you know the information enough? Did you train and drill and rep it enough for that underhook to come out in a different situation that isn't orchestrated and planned?
So that's under the stress of live rolling and under the stress of a tournament. Is it wired in? And there are times where it is wired in. There are times where you go, you fail completely and you go back to your old bad habits. And then there are times where you're like, and it's that process of learning and that evolution where you're like, oh, I'm in the situation again. You're becoming aware. And then you have to think about it. And through that practice, it eventually under stress also becomes natural for you to do that. You don't have to think about it.
Right.
So it's that same process, and I think that's where like the hardest part is under the stress of competition or the stress of family in
Yeah.
life.
Because it's real life. It's real life. And I think that that's where it's like in jiu-jitsu on the floor, most students are seeking correction and the critical eye from coach. Like they want the feedback. Is my hand right? Is my leg right? When you move them off of the floor, usually people are not seeking that kind of feedback. And it's because they're emotionally making the decision of, well, here I want feedback and I want to know when I make mistakes. But whenever we step outside of here, I don't want feedback about making mistakes. And when people can transition that mentality of that forever student, that helps create a little bit of distance between stimulus and response to where they can start changing the way they're wired and start reacting in a healthier way. And I think that the exercises you mentioned, like the gratitude list and focusing on being grateful and finding ways to connect with that, that's what frees people, because no belt, no championship, no amount of money is ever going to fulfill you. It can make life easier, but it will never be the fulfillment. It's the path to fulfillment. It's part of that journey. And
Yes.
I think you really gave some good insight for people that can connect with that, because that's one thing, especially as higher level athletes, people get black belts, they're competitors, they're fighters, and this facade of you're just tough and in control and you don't have regular problems. And I feel like a lot of students and people out there connect with the vulnerability issues because they're lower ranks, they're newer, they're thinking about quitting jiu-jitsu. They're thinking they're never going to get it, or they got stuff off the mats that is just kind of controlling their lives. So, sharing a few of your stories and what you've done to overcome some of those struggles is very appreciated. Really appreciate the time that you kind of dedicated to me today to talk about jiu-jitsu and some of the fun stories. Is there anything you'd like to finish with today?
No, I think, there's so much to be gained at every level, and there's so many parallels to our life, and it just eventually becomes part of your life and part of who you are. Like we were saying, so many things, whether you think about them as a direct connection, even like some of the stuff I wasn't aware of until we kind of started talking about it. I think jiu-jitsu just brings so much to people, and it's just such a great time, not the quarantine time, but this time in jiu-jitsu, that we are able to, as I said, plug, roll forever, because it does give so many people so much. And just watching how a lot of older people coming to the sport and getting so much, where in the old days it'd been like, why even bother? You're not going to be a fighter. You're not going to be able to do this. But it is so fulfilling to people in so many ways. And it just is pretty awesome.
Well, you're definitely a leader and advocate, and you've paved the way for so many people in the jiu-jitsu industry. And you're continuing to do so with your art and kind of your interaction with the community. So I definitely appreciate that, and definitely appreciate the time today. And I hope you guys have a good day out there, and we'll definitely stay in touch.
Thanks for having me.